I don't know why I do things, but inexplicably, I got the itch to try and watch some old fantasy shows from the 90s and the 80s, and I fell onto a show called Roar. Roar is an interesting show, mainly because it stars a very young Heath Ledger in what was probably one of his first major acting roles. It was also created by Sean Cassidy, which is one of those weird fun facts that Sean Cassidy, who was a teen idol who started in the Hardy Boys and released a few albums, then went on to become a notable television creator, with probably his best show being American Gothic. Now, Roar is an interesting show. It is an older type of fantasy, and partly why I had a desire to watch something like Roar is I was curious to watch fantasy shows that came out before Lord of the Rings. Why? Because I wanted to see fantasy shows that weren't influenced by the Lord of the Rings movies. I'm always curious by that because what they have to draw on is very different sources. Uh, and Roar was very obviously made in an attempt to follow the success of Hercules and Xena. So it's a very rare genre that doesn't really exist nowadays. It's a historical fantasy. Now, Roar is about Heath Ledger's character, whose father and entire family is killed by an evil Celt king who has aligned himself with the Romans, and it involves Heath Ledger slowly uniting the disparate tribes of the Celts to form a rebellion against the Romans. I've only seen the first episode, forgive me. And this has been a mostly forgotten show, but it did make me kind of misty-eyed for what is now an incredibly rare genre, which is the historical fantasy, which doesn't really have as much prominence as it did in times past. Now, what's interesting about historical fantasies is that it seemed to at one point been the default form of fantasy, at least for movies and television. We weren't interested in constructed worlds, we were interested in real worlds that also had elves and magic and all this stuff, with the horrific implication of that all the magic at some point has to disappear. Now, if you're curious, I was trying to explain this and people were very blindsided by this idea, I guess. Historical fantasy, one of the three main pillars of the fantasy genre. And the thing about fantasy, fundamentally, when you break it down, there are only really three types of fantasy: historical fantasy, second world fantasy, and constructed world fantasy. Historical fantasy. Now, the basic premise of historical fantasy, story-wise and construction-wise, historical fantasy is not all that different from any other type of fantasy, but the basic assumption with historical fantasy is that this has happened in our past somewhere, and we have just simply forgotten about the magic that exists. So historical fantasy will have take place in a real world location in a real time period, will occasionally probably feature real people that actually existed, but it will still have things like elves and magic and curses and all the things that medieval people of the time assumed were real. We understand that, right? What about the other two broad categories? Well, the other one is second world fantasy. Now, second world fantasy it's pretty popular these days, and you most likely have seen a second world fantasy. The basic plot of a second world fantasy, it is somebody from our world who somehow gets transported into a fantastical world, and the fantastical world exists on a parallel plane to ours in some way. That is pretty much a second world fantasy. Now, the second world fantasy is an academic term, and you may now better know this idea as isekai fantasy, because isekai just translates into different world, and another way you could say that is second world. Now, the third type of fantasy is constructed world. Constructed world is the fantasy that you are probably most familiar with. Constructed world means regular types of fantasy. This is a world that creates its own history, its own peoples, its own names, kingdoms. Nothing from our world exists in constructed world fantasy. We are tuned to be reading or watching or seeing a world outside of ours, even though it will oftentimes resemble our world in many ways, but that's another video. So I believe I've firmly established the rules for each of these worlds. Now, here's the thing. Any attempt to broadly categorize any genre, there's going to be some issues, and there's going to be some very border cases. So let's look at some examples. A good example of a very borderline case is Outlander. Now, it's about a woman from 1940s getting transported back into the past to ancient Scotland. So, is that second world or is that historical? I'm going to put a stamp on it. It is officially historical fantasy. I know the thing I said where second world is about somebody traveling back and forth, but the trick with second world is you are going to a constructed world. A second world is literally another world that exists outside of our historical place. Because the main character of Outlander is just going back into the past, historical fantasy. The one that's really going to screw me over, the one that I have a little trouble placing, is urban fantasy. See, urban fantasy kind of messes with my very clean, very concise, very needed precision of genre. Does it count as historical fantasy or does it count as second world fantasy? I think the important thing to keep in mind with urban fantasy is a baseline question with urban fantasy. Is the secret out? If the secret is out, then that probably fits more under the definition of historical fantasy. But if it is a masquerade, if it is a, follow me on this, literal secret world, then what do we have? Well, we have a character who can seamlessly travel between the hidden world behind the scenes and the modern world of normal everydayness. And I feel like that fits under second world much more accurately than it does under historical fantasy. The other one that totally fucks up my neat, very perfect definition that I like is Lord of the Rings. Now, if you're unaware of this, Professor Tolkien was very clear that Lord of the Rings is not a fake constructed world. No, it is our very ancient past, and in many ways should be considered almost a prequel to the Arthurian myth. And that would mean that Lord of the Rings, one of the main things people take inspiration from for constructed world, should, under my definition of secret lost histories, be considered historical fantasy. Categories are stupid, and I regret trying to figure this out. But if I'm serious about these rules, then it may very well be historical fantasy.